sack of armor. Mattel screamed at Kaladin in a panic, but the bridge crews were already in motion. Kaladin focused on his goal, protecting Bridge 4, and sucked in sharply. Stormlight flooded him from the pouch at his waist, but he didn't draw too much, just enough to give him a jolt of energy. Sills zipped in front of him, a ripple in the air, nearly invisible. Kaladin whipped the tie off the sack, pulling out the vest and throwing it awkwardly over his head. He ignored the ties at the side, getting on the helm as he leaped over a small rock formation. The shield came last, clattering with red Parshendi bones in a crisscross pattern on the front. Even while donning the armor, Kaladin easily stayed far ahead of the heavily laden bridge crews. His stormlight-infused legs were quick and sure. The Parshendi archers, directly ahead of him, abruptly stopped singing. Several of them lowered their bows, and though it was too distant to make out their faces, he could sense their outrage. Kaladin had expected this. He'd hoped for it. The Parshendi left their dead, not because they were uncaring, but because they found it a terrible offense to move them. Merely touching the dead seemed a sin. If that was the case, a man desecrating corpses and wearing them into battle would be far, far worse. As Kaladin grew closer, a different song started among the Parshendi archers. A quick, violent song, more chant than melody. Those who had lowered their bows raised them, and they tried with everything they had to kill him. Arrows flew at him, dozens of them. They weren't fired in careful waves. They flew individually, rapidly, wildly, each archer loosing at Kaladin as quickly as he could. A swarm of death bore down on him. Pulse racing, Kaladin ducked to the left, leaping off a small outcropping. Arrows sliced the air around him, dangerously close. But while infused with the stormlight, his muscles reacted quickly. He dodged between arrows, then turned in the other direction, moving erratically. Behind, Bridge 4 came into range, and not a single arrow was fired at them. Other bridge crews were ignored as well, many of the archers focusing on Kaladin. The arrows came more swiftly, spraying around him, bouncing off his shield. One sliced open his arm as it shot past. Another snapped against his helm, nearly knocking it free. The arm wound leaked light, not blood, and to Kaladin's amazement, it slowly began to seal up, frost crystallizing on his skin and stormlight draining from him. He drew in more, infusing himself to the cusp of glowing visibility. He ducked, he dodged, he jumped, he ran. His battle-trained reflexes delighted in the newfound speed, and he used the shield to knock arrows out of the air. It was as if his body had longed for this ability, as if it had been born to take advantage of the stormlight. During the earlier part of his life, he had lived sluggish and impotent. Now he was healed, not acting beyond his capacities, no, finally reaching them. A flock of arrows sought his blood, but Kaladin spun between them, taking another slice on the arm but deflecting the others with shield or breastplate. The flight came, and he brought his shield up, worried that he was going to be too slow. However, the arrows changed course, arcing toward his shield, slamming into it, drawn to it. I'm pulling them to it. He remembered dozens of bridge runs with arrows slamming into the wood near where his hands had clung to the support bars, always just missing him. How long have I been doing this? Kaladin thought. How many arrows did I draw to the bridge, pulling them away from me? He didn't have time to think about that. He kept moving, dodging. He felt arrows whish through the air, heard them zip, felt the splinters as they hit stone or shield and broke. He'd hoped that he would distract some of the Parshendi from firing on his men, but he'd had no idea how strong a reaction he'd get. Part of him exulted in the thrill of ducking, dodging, and blocking the hail of arrows. He started to slow, however. He tried to suck in stormlight, but none came. His spheres were drained. He panicked, still dodging, but then the arrow falls began to slacken. With a start, Kaladin realized that the bridge crews had parted around him, leaving a space for him to keep dodging while they passed him and set their burdens. Bridge 4 was in place, cavalry charging across to attack the archers. Despite that, some of the Parshendi continued to fire on Kaladin, enraged. The soldiers cut these Parshendi down easily, sweeping the ground of them and making room for Sadeas's foot soldiers. Kaladin lowered his shield. It bristled with arrows. He barely had time to take a fresh breath of air as the bridgemen reached him, calling out with joy, nearly tackling him in their excitement. "You fool," Moash said. "You storming fool! What was that? What were you thinking?"
"Was incredible,"
Rock said. "You should be dead," Sigzil said, though his normally stern face was split by a smile. "Stormfather," Moash added, pulling an arrow from Kaladin's vest at the shoulder. "Look at these." Kaladin looked down, shocked to find a dozen arrow holes in the sides of his vest and shirt where he'd narrowly avoided being hit. 3 arrows stuck from the leather. "Storm-blessed," Scar said. "That's all there is to it." Kaladin shrugged off their praise, his heart still pounding. He was numb. Amazed that he'd survived, cold from the stormlight he'd consumed, exhausted as if he'd run a rigorous obstacle course. He looked to Teft, raising an eyebrow, nodding toward the pouch at his waist. Teft shook his head. He'd watched. The stormlight rising from Kaladin hadn't been visible to those observing, not in the light of day. Still, the way Kaladin had dodged would have looked incredible, even without the obvious light. If there had been stories about him before, they would grow greatly following this. He turned to look at the passing troops. As he did, he realized something. He still had to deal with Matal. "Fall into line, men," he said. They obeyed reluctantly, falling into place around him in a double rank. Ahead, Matal stood beside their bridge. He looked concerned, as well he should. Sarius was riding up. Kaladin steeled himself, remembering how his previous victory, when they'd run with the bridge on its side, had been turned on its head. He hesitated, then hurried over toward the bridge where Sarius was going to ride past Matal. Kaladin's men followed. Kaladin arrived as Matal bowed to Sarius, who wore his glorious red shard plate. Kaladin and the bridgemen bowed as well. "Avarak Matal?" Sarius said. He nodded toward Kaladin. "This man looks familiar." "He is the one from before, Bright Lord," Matal said, nervous. "The one who—" "Ah, yes," Sarius said. "The miracle. And you sent him forward as a decoy like that? One would think that you would be hesitant to dare such measures." "I take full responsibility, Bright Lord," Matal said, putting the best face on it. Sarius regarded the battlefield. "Well, luckily for you, it worked. I suppose I'll have to promote you now." He shook his head. "Those savages practically ignored the assault force. All 20 bridges set, most with nary a casualty. It seems like a waste somehow. Consider yourself commended. Most remarkable the way that boy dodged." He kicked his horse into motion, leaving Matal and the bridgemen behind. It was the most backhanded promotion Kaladin had ever heard, but that would do. Kaladin smiled broadly as Matal turned to him, eyes enraged. "You," Matal sputtered. "You could have gotten me executed." "Instead, I got you promoted," Kaladin said, Bridge 4 forming around him. "I should see you strung up anyway." "It's been tried," Kaladin said. "Didn't work. Besides, you know that from now on Sarius is going to expect me to be out there distracting the archers? Good luck getting any other bridgeman to try that." Matal's face grew red. He turned and stalked away to check on the other bridge crews. The 2 nearest, Bridge 7 and Bridge 18, stood looking toward Kaladin and his team. All 20 bridges had been set? Hardly any casualties? Stormfather, Kaladin thought. How many archers were firing at me? "You did it, Kaladin!" Moash exclaimed. "You found the secret. We need to make this work. Expand it." "I'll bet I could dodge those arrows if that were all I was doing," Scar said. "With enough armor." "We should have more than one," Moash agreed. 5 or so running around drawing the Parshendi attacks.
"The bones,"
Rock said, folding his arms.
"This is what made it work. The Parshendi were so mad that they ignored bridge crew. If all 5 were the bones of Parshendi,
That made Kaladin consider something. He looked back, searching through the bridgemen. Where was Shen? There. He was sitting on the rocks, distant, staring forward. Kaladin approached with the others. The Parshman looked up at him, face a mask of pain, tears streaking his cheeks. He looked at Kaladin and shuddered visibly, turning away, closing his eyes.
he sat down like that the moment he saw what you'd done, lad,
Teft said, rubbing his chin.
Might not be good for bridge runs anymore.
Kaladin pulled the carapace-tied helm off his head, then ran his fingers through his hair. The carapace stuck to his clothing stank faintly, even though he'd washed it off down below. We'll see, Kaladin said, feeling a twist of guilt. Not nearly enough to overshadow the victory of protecting his men, but enough to dampen it at least. For now, there are still many bridge crews that got fired upon. You know what to do? The men nodded, trotting off to search for the wounded. Kaladin set one man to watch over Shen. He wasn't sure what else to do with the Parshman, and tried not to show his exhaustion as he put his sweaty, carapace-covered cap and vest in Lopin's litter. He knelt down to go through his medical equipment, in case it was needed, and found that his hand was shaking and quivering. He pressed it down against the ground to still it, breathing in and out. Cold, clammy skin, he thought. Nausea, weakness. He was in shock.
You all right, lad?
Teft asked, kneeling down beside Kaladin. He still wore a bandage on his arm from the wound he'd taken a few bridge runs back, but it wasn't enough to stop him from carrying. Not when there were too few as it was. I'll be fine, Kaladin said, taking out a water skin, holding it in a quivering hand. He could barely get the top off.
You don't look.
I'll be fine, Kaladin said again, drinking, then lowering the water. What's important is that the men are safe.
You going to do this every time? Whenever we go to battle?
Whatever keeps them safe.
You're not immortal, Kaladin,
Teft said softly.
The Radiants, they could be killed just like any man. Sooner or later, one of those arrows will find your neck instead of your shoulder.
The Stormlight heals.
The Stormlight helps your body heal. That's different, I'm thinking.
Teft laid a hand on Kaladin's shoulder.
We can't lose you, lad. The men need you.
I'm not going to avoid putting myself in danger, Teft. And I'm not going to leave the men to face a storm of arrows if I can do something about it.
Well,
Teft said.
you're going to let a few of us go out there with you. The bridge can manage with 25 if it has to. That leaves us a few extra, just like Rock said. And I'll bet some of those wounded from the other crews we saved are well enough to begin helping carry. They won't dare send them back to their own crews, not so long as Bridge 4 is doing what you did today, and helping the whole assault work.
Kaladin trailed off. He could imagine Dalit doing something like this. He'd always said that as a sergeant, part of his job was to keep Kaladin alive. All right. Teft nodded, rising. You were a spearman, Teft, Kaladin said. Don't try to deny it. How did you end up here, in these bridge crews?
It's where I belong.
Teft turned away to supervise the search for wounded. Kaladin sat down, then lay back, waiting for the shock to wear off. To the south, the other army, flying the blue of Dalinar Kholin, had arrived. They crossed to an adjacent plateau. Kaladin closed his eyes to recover. Eventually, he heard something and opened his eyes. Syl sat cross-legged on his chest. Behind her, Dalinar Kholin's army had begun an assault onto the battlefield, and they managed to do so without getting fired on. Sadeas had the Parshendi cut off. That was amazing, Kaladin said to Syl. What I did with the arrows. Still think you're cursed? No. I know I'm not. He looked up at the overcast sky. But that means the failures were all just me. I let Tien die. I failed my spearmen. The slaves I tried to rescue. Terra? He hadn't thought of her in some time. His failure with her had been different from the others, but a failure it was nonetheless. If there's no curse of bad luck, no god above being angry at me, I have to live with knowing that with a little more effort, a little more practice or skill, I could have saved them. Syl frowned more deeply. Kaladin, you need to get over this. Those things aren't your fault. That's what my father used to say. He smiled faintly. Overcome your guilt, Kaladin. Care, but not too much. Take responsibility, but don't blame yourself. Protect, save, help, but know when to give up. There's such precarious ledges to walk. How do I do it?
Alright, one more hit.
I don't know. I don't know any of this, Kaladin.
Give up.
But you're ripping yourself apart. Inside and out. Kaladin stared at the sky above.
Don't know what that
It
is.
was wondrous. I was a storm, Syl. The Parshendi couldn't touch me. The arrows were nothing. You're too new to this. You pushed yourself too hard. Save them, Kaladin whispered. Do the impossible, Kaladin. But don't push yourself too hard. But also don't feel guilty if you fail. Precarious ledges, Syl. So narrow. Some of his men returned with a wounded man, a square-faced Thalen fellow with an arrow in the shoulder. Kaladin went to work. His hands were still shaking slightly, but not nearly as badly as they had been. The bridgemen clustered around, watching. He'd started training Rock, Drahi, and Scar already, but with all of them watching, Kaladin found himself explaining. If you put pressure here, you can slow the blood flow. This isn't too dangerous a wound, though it probably doesn't feel too good. The patient grimaced his agreement. And the real problem will come from infection. Wash the wound to make sure there aren't any slivers of wood or bits of metal left, then sew it. The muscles and skin of the shoulder here are going to get worked, so you need a strong thread to hold the wound together. Now, Kaladin, Lopin said, sounding worried. What? Kaladin said, distracted, still working. Kaladin! Lopin had called him by his name, rather than saying Gancho. Kaladin stood up, turning to see the short Herdazian man standing at the back of the crowd, pointing at the chasm. The battle had moved farther north, but a group of Parshendi had punched through Sadeas's line. They had bows. Kaladin watched, stunned, as the group of Parshendi fell into formation and knocked. 50 arrows, all pointed at Kaladin's crew. The Parshendi didn't seem to care that they were exposing themselves to attack from behind. They seemed focused on only one thing: destroying Kaladin and his men. Kaladin screamed the alarm, but he felt so sluggish, so tired. The bridgemen around him turned as the archers drew. Sadeas's men normally defended the chasm to keep Parshendi from pushing over the bridges and cutting off their escape. But this time, noticing that the archers weren't trying to drop the bridges, the soldiers didn't hasten to stop them. They left the bridgemen to die, instead cutting off the Parshendi route to the bridges themselves. Kaladin's men were exposed. Perfect targets. No, Kaladin thought. No, it can't happen like this. Not after... A force crashed into the Parshendi line. A single figure in slate-gray armor wielding a sword as long as many men were tall. The shard-bearers swept through the distracted archers with urgency, slicing into their ranks. Arrows flew toward Kaladin's team, but they were loosed too early, aimed poorly. A few came close as the bridgemen ducked for cover, but nobody was hit. Parshendi fell before the sweeping blade of the shard-bearer, some toppling into the chasm, others scrambling back. The rest died with burned-out eyes. In seconds, the squad of 50 archers had been reduced to corpses. The shard-bearer's honor guard caught up with him. He turned, armor seeming to glow as he raised his blade in a salute of respect toward the bridgeman. Then he charged off in another direction. That was him, Drahi said, standing up. Dalinar Kholin, the king's uncle. He saved us, Lopin said. Bah! Moash dusted himself off. He just saw a group of undefended archers and took the chance to strike. Light Eyes don't care about us. Right, Kaladin? Kaladin stared at the place where the archers had stood. In one moment, he could have lost it all. Kaladin? Moash said. You're right, Kaladin found himself saying. Just an opportunity taken. Except why raise the blade toward Kaladin? From now on, Kaladin said, we pull back farther after the soldiers cross. They used to ignore us after the battle began, but they won't any longer. What I did today, what we're all going to be doing soon, will make them mighty angry. Angry enough to be stupid, but also angry enough to see us dead. For now, Leighton, Narm, find good scouting points and watch the field. I want to know if any Parshendi make moves toward that chasm. I'll get this man bandaged, and we'll pull back. The two scouts ran off, and Kaladin turned back to the man with the wounded shoulder. Moash knelt beside him. An assault against a prepared foe without any bridges lost? A shard-bearer coincidentally coming to our rescue? Sadeas himself complimenting us. You almost make me think I should get one of those armbands. Kaladin glanced down at the prayer. It was stained with blood from a slice on his arm that the vanishing stormlight hadn't quite been able to heal. Wait to see if we escape. Kaladin finished the stitching. That's the real test. 63. Fear. I wish to sleep. I know now why you do what you do, and I hate you for it. I will not speak of the truths I see. Kakasha, 1173. 142 seconds pre-death. A Shin sailor, left behind by his crew, reportedly for bringing them ill luck. Sample largely useless. You see? Leighton turned the piece of carapace over in his hands. If we carve it up at the edge, it encourages a blade, or in this case an arrow, to deflect away from the face. Wouldn't want to spoil that pretty grin of yours. Kaladin smiled, taking back the piece of armor. Leighton had carved it expertly, putting in holes for leather straps to affix it to the jerkin. The chasm was cold and dark at night. With the sky hidden, it felt like a cavern. Only the occasional sparkle of a star high above revealed otherwise. How soon can you have them done? He asked Leighton. All 5? By the end of the night, likely. The real trick was discovering how to work it. He knocked on the carapace with the back of his knuckles. Amazing stuff. Nearly as hard as steel, but half the weight. Hard to cut or break. But if you drill, it shapes easily. Good, Kaladin said. Because I don't want 5 sets. I want one for each man in the crew. Leighton raised an eyebrow. If they're going to start letting us wear armor, Kaladin said, everyone gets a suit. Except Shen, of course. Matal had agreed to let them leave him behind on the bridge runs. He wouldn't even look at Kaladin now. Leighton nodded. All right, then. Better get me some help, though. You can use the wounded men. We'll cart out as much carapace as we can find. His success had translated to an easier time for Bridge 4. Kaladin had pled that his men needed time to find carapace, and Hashal, not knowing any better, had reduced the scavenging quota. She was already pretending, quite smoothly, that the armor had been her idea the entire time. When she met Kaladin's eyes, however, he saw worry. What else would he try? So far, she hadn't dared remove him. Not while he brought her so much praise from Sadeas. How did an apprentice armorer end up as a bridgeman anyway? Kaladin asked as Leighton settled back down to work. He was a thick-armed man, stout and oval-faced with light hair. Craftsmen don't usually get thrown away. Leighton shrugged. When a piece of armor breaks and a Light Eyes takes an arrow in the shoulder, someone has to take the blame. I'm convinced my master keeps an extra apprentice, especially for those kinds of situation. Well, his loss is our good fortune. You're going to keep us alive.
I'll do my best, sir. He smiled. Can't do much worse on the armor than you did yourself, though. It's amazing that breastplate didn't fall off halfway through. Kaladin patted the bridgeman on the shoulder, then left him to his work, surrounded by a small ring of topaz chips. Kaladin had gotten permission to bring them, explaining his men needed light to work on the armor. Nearby, Lopen, Rock, and David were returning with another load of salvage. Sills zipped ahead, leading them. Kaladin walked down the chasm, a garnet sphere looped in a small leather carrier at his belt for light. The chasm branched here, making a large triangular intersection, a perfect place for spear training. Wide enough to give the men room to practice, yet far enough from any permanent bridges that scouts weren't likely to hear echoes. Kaladin gave the initial instructions each day, then let Teft lead the practice. The men worked by sphere light, small piles of diamond chips at the corners of the intersection, barely enough to see by. Never thought I'd envy those days practicing beneath the hot sun back in Amaram's army, he thought. He walked up to gap-toothed Hopper and corrected his stance, then showed him how to set his weight behind his spear thrusts. The bridgemen were progressing quickly, and the fundamentals were proving their merit. Some were training with the spear and the shield, practicing stances where they held lighter spears up beside the head with the shield raised. The most skilled were Scar and Moash. In fact, Moash was surprisingly good. Kaladin walked to the side, watching the hawk-faced man. He was focused, eyes intense, jaw set. He moved in attack after attack, the dozen spheres giving him an equal number of shadows. Kaladin remembered feeling such dedication. He'd spent a year like that after Tian's death, driving himself to exhaustion each day, determined to get better, determined never to let another person die because of his lack of skill. He'd become the best in his squad, then the best in his company. Some said he'd been the best spearman in Amaram's army. What would have happened to him if Terra hadn't coaxed him out of his single-minded dedication? Would he have burned himself out, as she'd claimed? Moash, Kaladin called. Moash paused, turning toward Kaladin. He didn't fall out of stance. Kaladin waved him to approach, and Moash reluctantly trotted over. Lopen had left a few water skins for them, hanging by their cords from a cluster of haspers. Kaladin pulled a skin free, tossing it to Moash. The other man took a drink, then wiped his mouth. You're getting good, Kaladin said. You're probably the best we have. Thanks, Moash said. I've noticed you keep training when Teft lets the other men take breaks. Dedication is good, but don't work yourself ragged. I want you to be one of the decoys. Moash smiled broadly. Each of the men had volunteered to be one of the 4 who would join Kaladin distracting the Parshendi. It was amazing. Months ago, Moash, along with the others, had eagerly placed the new or the weak at the front of the bridge to catch arrows. Now, to a man, they volunteered for the most dangerous jobs. Do you realize what you could have in these men, Sadius? Kaladin thought. If you weren't so busy thinking of how to get them killed? So what is it for you? Kaladin said, nodding toward the dim practice ground. Why do you work so hard? What is it you hunt? Vengeance, the other man said, face somber. Kaladin nodded. I lost someone once, because I wasn't good enough with the spear. I nearly killed myself practicing. Who was it? My brother. Moash nodded. The other bridgemen, Moash included, seemed to regard Kaladin's mysterious past with reverence. I'm glad I trained, Kaladin said, and I'm glad you're dedicated. But you have to be careful. If I'd gotten myself killed by working so hard, it wouldn't have meant anything. Sure, but there's a difference between us, Kaladin. Kaladin raised an eyebrow. You wanted to be able to save someone. Me? I want to kill somebody. Who? Moash hesitated, then shook his head. Maybe I'll say someday. He reached out, grabbing Kaladin on the shoulder. I'd surrendered my plans, but you've returned them to me. I'll guard you with my life, Kaladin. I swear it to you, by the blood of my fathers. Kaladin met Moash's intense eyes and nodded. All right, then. Go help Haber and Yake. They're still off on their thrusts. Moash jogged off to do as told. He didn't call Kaladin Sir, and didn't seem to regard him with the same unspoken reverence as the others. That made Kaladin more comfortable with him. Kaladin spent the next hour helping the men one by one. Most of them were overeager, throwing themselves into their attacks. Kaladin explained the importance of control and precision, which won more fights than chaotic enthusiasm. They took it in, listening. More and more they reminded him of his old spear squad. That set him thinking. He remembered how he had felt when originally proposing the escape plan to the men. He'd been looking for something to do, a way to fight, no matter how risky, a chance. Things had changed. He now had a team he was proud of, friends he had come to love, and a possibility, perhaps, for stability. If they could get the dodging and armor right, they might be reasonably safe. Maybe even as safe as his old spear squad had been. Was running still the best option?
That is a worried face,
a rumbling voice noted. Kaladin turned as Rock walked up and leaned against the wall near him, holding powerful forearms.
Is the face of a leader, say I. Always troubled.
Rock raised a bushy red eyebrow. Sadeas will never let us go, particularly not now that we're so prominent. Alethi Light Eyes considered it reprehensible for a man to let slaves escape. It made him seem impotent. Capturing those who ran away was essential to save face.
You said this thing before, Rock said. We will fight the men he sends after us. We'll seek Kharbranth, where there are no slaves. From there, the peaks, to my people who will welcome us as heroes.
We might beat the first group, if he's foolish and sends only a few dozen men. But after that, he'll send more. And what of our wounded? Do we leave them here to die? Or do we take them with us and go that much more slowly? Rock nodded slowly.
You are saying that we need a plan?
Yes, Kaladin said. I guess that's what I'm saying. Either that or we stay here as bridgemen.
Ha!
Rock seemed to take it as a joke.
Despite new armor, we would die soon. We make ourselves targets.
Kaladin hesitated. Rock was right. The bridgemen would be used day in and day out. Even if Kaladin slowed the death toll to 2 or 3 men a month, once he would have considered that impossible, but now it seemed within reach. Bridge 4, as it was currently composed, would be gone within a year.
I will talk with Sigzil about this thing,
Rock said, rubbing his chin between the sides of his beard.
We will think. There must be a way to escape this trap. A way to disappear. A false trail? A distraction? Perhaps we can convince Sadeas that we have died during Bridge Run.
How do we do that?
Don't know, Rock said. But we will think.
He nodded to Kaladin and sauntered off toward Sigzil. The Azish man was practicing with the others. Kaladin had tried speaking to him about Hoyd, but Sigzil, typically close-mouthed, hadn't wanted to discuss it. Hey, Kaladin, Scar called. He was part of an advanced group that was going through Teft's very carefully supervised sparring. Come spar with us. Show these rock-brained fools how it's really done. The others began calling for him as well. Kaladin waved them down, shaking his head. Teft trotted over, a heavy spear on one shoulder. Lad, he said quietly, I think it would be good for their morale if you showed them a thing or two yourself. I've already given them instruction. With a spear you knock the head off of. Going very slowly with lots of talk. They need to see it, lad. See you. We've been through this, Teft. Well, so we have. Kaladin smiled.
Teft was careful not to look angry or belligerent. He looked as if he were having a normal conversation with Kaladin. You've been a sergeant before, haven't you?
Never mind that. Come on. Just show them a few simple routines.
No, Teft, Kaladin said more seriously. Teft eyed him.
You going to refuse to fight on the battlefield, just like that Horn-Eater?
It's not like that.
Well, what is it like?
Kaladin reached for an explanation. I'll fight when the time comes. But if I let myself get back into it now, I'll be too eager. I'll push to attack now. I'll have trouble waiting until the men are ready. Trust me, Teft. Teft studied him.
You're scared of it, lad.
What? No,
I can see it,
Teft said.
and I've seen it before. Last time you fought for someone, you failed, eh? So now you hesitate to take it up again.
Kaladin paused. Yes, he admitted. But it was more than that. When he fought again, he would have to become that man from long ago. The man who had been called Stormblessed. The man with confidence and strength. He wasn't certain he could be that man any longer. That was what scared him. Once he held that spear again, there would be no turning back.
Well,
Teft rubbed his chin.
when the time comes, I hope you're ready,
Oh,
because this lot will need you.
Kaladin nodded, and Teft hurried back to the others, giving some kind of explanation to mollify them. 64. A man of extremes. They come from the pit. 2 dead men. A heart in their hands, and I know that I have seen true glory. Kakasha, 1173. 13 seconds pre-death. A rickshaw puller. I couldn't decide if you were interested or not, Navani said softly to Dalinar, as they slowly walked around the grounds of Elhakar's raised field palace. Half the time you seemed like a flirt, offering hints at courtship, then backing away. The other half of the time I was certain I had misread you, and Gavilar was so forthcoming. He always did prefer to seize what he wished. Dalinar nodded thoughtfully. He wore his blue uniform, while Navani was in a subdued maroon dress with a thick hem. Elhakar's gardeners had begun to cultivate the plant life here. To their right, a twisting length of yellow shale bark rose to waist height like a railing. The stone-like plant was overgrown by small bunches of haspers, with pearly shells slowly opening and closing as they breathed. They looked like tiny mouths, silently speaking in rhythm with one another. Dalinar and Navani's pathway took a leisurely course up the hillside. Dalinar strolled with hands clasped behind his back. His honor guard and Navani's clerks followed behind. A few of them looked perplexed at the amount of time Dalinar and Navani were spending with one another. How many of them suspected the truth? All? Part? None? Did it matter?
I didn't mean to confuse you. All those years ago,
He said, voice soft to keep it from prying ears.
I had intended to court you, but Galavar expressed a preference for you. So eventually, I felt I had to step aside.
Just like that? Navani asked. She sounded offended.
He didn't realize that I was interested. He thought that by introducing you to him, I was indicating that he should court you. That was often how our relationship worked. I would discover people Gavilar should know, then bring them to him. I didn't realize until too late what I had done in giving you to him.
Giving me? Is there a slave's brand on my forehead of which I've been unaware?
I did not mean...
Oh, hush, Navani said, her voice suddenly fond. Dalinar stifled a sigh. Though Navani had matured since their youth, her moods always had changed as quickly as the seasons. In truth, that was part of her allure. Did you often step aside for him? Navani asked.
Always.
Didn't that grow tiresome?
I didn't think about it much, Dalinar said. When I did, yes, I was frustrated. But it was Gavilar. You know how he was. That force of will, that air of natural entitlement. It always seemed to surprise him when someone denied him or when the world itself didn't do as he wished. He didn't force me to defer. It was simply how life was. Navani nodded in understanding. Regardless, Dalinar said,
Don't touch this, motherfucker.
I apologize for confusing you. Well, I had difficulty letting go. I fear that, on occasion, I let too much of my true feelings slip out.
Well, I suppose I can forgive that, she said. Though you did spend the next 2 decades making certain I thought you hated me.
I did nothing of the sort.
Oh? And how else was I to interpret your coldness? The way you would often leave the room when I arrived.
Containing myself, Dalinar said. I had made my decision.
Well, it looked a lot like hatred, Navani said. Though I did wonder several times what you were hiding behind those stony eyes of yours. Of course, then shh came along. As always, when the name of his wife was spoken, it came to him as the sound of softly rushing air, then slipped from his mind immediately. He could not hear or remember the name. She changed everything, Navani said. You truly seemed to love her.
I did, Dalinar said.
Surely he had loved her, hadn't he? He could remember nothing.
What was she like?
He quickly added,
I mean, in your opinion. How did you see her?
Everyone loved shh, Navani said. I tried hard to hate her, but in the end I could only be mildly jealous.
You? Jealous of her? Whatever for?
Because, Navani said, she fit you so well, never making inappropriate comments, never bullying those around her, always so calm. Navani smiled. Thinking back, I really should have been able to hate her, but she was just so nice. Though she wasn't very, well...
What?
Dalinar asked. Clever, Navani said. She blushed, which was rare for her. I'm sorry, Dalinar, but she just wasn't. She wasn't a fool, but... well, not everyone can be cunning. Perhaps that was part of her charm. She seemed to think that Dalinar would be offended.
It's all right, he said. Were you surprised that I married her?
Who could be surprised? As I said, she was perfect for you.
Because we were matched intellectually? Dalinar said dryly.
He threw me over the wall.
Hardly. But you were matched in temperament. For a time after I got over trying to hate her, I thought that the 4 of us could be quite close. But you were so stiff toward me.
I could not allow any further lapses to make you think that I was still interested.
He said the last part awkwardly. After all, wasn't that what he was doing now? Lapsing? Navani eyed him. There you go again.
What?
Feeling guilty. Dalinar, you are a wonderful, honorable man, but you really are quite prone to self-indulgence. Guilt? As self-indulgence?
I never considered it that way before.
She smiled deeply.
What?
He asked. You really are genuine, aren't you, Dalinar?
I try to be, he said.
He glanced over his shoulder.
Though the nature of our relationship continues to perpetuate a kind of lie.
We've lied to nobody. Let them think or guess what they wish.
I suppose you are right.
I usually am. She fell silent for a moment. Do you regret what we have?
No, Dalinar said sharply.
the strength of his objection surprising him. Navani just smiled. No, Dalinar continued more gently. I do not regret this, Navani. I don't know how to proceed, but I am not going to let go. Navani hesitated beside a growth of tiny fist-sized rock buds, with their vines out like long green tongues. They were grouped almost like a bouquet, growing on a large oval stone placed beside the pathway. I suppose it's too much to ask for you to not feel guilty, Navani said. Can't you let yourself bend just a little? I'm not certain if I can. Particularly not now. Explaining why would be difficult. Could you try to? For me? Well, I'm a man of extremes, Navani. I discovered that when I was a youth. I've learned repeatedly that the only way to control those extremes is to dedicate my life to something. First it was Gavilar. Now it's the codes and the teachings of Nohadon. They're the means by which I bind myself, like the enclosure of a fire, meant to contain and control it. He took a deep breath. I'm a weak man, Navani. I really am. If I give myself a few feet of leeway, I burst through all of my prohibitions. The momentum of following the codes these years, after Gavilar's death, is what keeps me strong. If I let a few cracks into that armor, I might return to the man I once was. A man I never want to be again. A man who had contemplated murdering his own brother for the throne. And for the woman who had married that brother. But he couldn't explain that. Didn't dare let Navani know what his desire for her had once almost driven him to do.
Oh,
On that day, Dalinar had sworn that he could never hold the throne himself. That was one of his restraints. Could he explain how she, without trying, pried at those restraints? How it was difficult to reconcile his long-fermenting love for her with his guilt at finally taking for himself what he'd long ago given up for his brother? You are not a weak man, Dalinar, Navani said. I am. But weakness can imitate strength if bound properly, just as cowardice can imitate heroism if given nowhere to flee. But there's nothing in Gavilar's book that prohibits us. It's just tradition that... It feels wrong, Dalinar said. But please, don't worry. I do enough worrying for both of us. I will find a way to make this work. I just ask your understanding. It will take time. When I display frustration, it is not with you, but with the situation. I suppose I can accept that, assuming you can live with the rumors. They're starting already. They won't be the first rumors to plague me, he said.
ow.
I'm starting to worry less about them and more about Elhokar. How will we explain to him? I doubt he'll notice, Navani said, snorting softly, resuming her walk. He followed. He's so fixated on the Parshendi and occasionally the idea that someone in camp is trying to kill him. This might feed into that, Dalinar said. He could read a number of conspiracies out of the two of us entering a relationship. Well, Horns began sounding loudly from below. Dalinar and Navani stopped to listen and identify the call. Stormfather, Dalinar said. That's the tower itself, where a chasm fiend has been seen. It's one of the plateaus Sadeas has been watching. Dalinar felt a surge of excitement. My princes have failed every time to win a gem heart there. It will be a major victory if he and I can do it together. Navani looked troubled. You're right about him, Dalinar. We do need him for our cause. But keep him at arm's length. Wish me the wind's favor. He reached toward her, but then stopped himself. What was he going to do? Embrace her here in public? That would set off the rumors like fire across a pool of oil. He wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, he bowed to her, then hastened off to answer the call and collect his shard plate. It wasn't until he was halfway down the path that he paused to consider Navani's choice of words. she had said, "We need him for our cause." What was their cause? He doubted that Navani knew either,
Oh,
but she had
shit.
already started to think of them as together in their efforts. And, he realized, so did he. The horns called, such a pure and beautiful sound to signify the imminence of battle. It caused a frenzy in the lumberyard. The orders had come down. The tower was to be assaulted again, the very place where Bridge 4 had failed, the place where Kaladin had caused a disaster. Largest of the plateaus, most coveted. Bridgemen ran this way and that for their vests. Carpenters and apprentices rushed out of the way. Matal shouted orders. An actual run was the only time he did that without Hashal. Bridge leaders, showing a modicum of leadership, bellowed for their teams to line up. A wind whipped the air, blowing wood chips and bits of dried grass into the sky. Men yelled, bells rang, and into this chaos strode Bridge 4, Kaladin at their head. Despite the urgency, soldiers stopped, bridgemen gaped, carpenters and apprentices stilled. 35 men marched in rusty orange carapace armor, expertly crafted by Leighton to fit onto leather jerkins and caps. They'd cut off arm guards and shin guards to complement the breastplates. The helms were built from several different headpieces and had been ornamented, at Leighton's insistence, with ridges and cuts, like tiny horns or the edges of a crab's shell. The breastplates and guards were ornamented as well, cut into tooth-like patterns, each one reminiscent of a saw blade. Earless Jacks had bought blue and white paint and drawn designs across the orange armor. Each member of Bridge 4 carried a large wooden shield, strapped, tightly now, with red Parshendi bones. Ribs, for the most part, shaped in spiral patterns.
For this area.
Some of the men had tied finger bones to the centers, so they would rattle, and others had attached protruding sharp ribs to the sides of their helms, giving them the look of fangs or mandibles. The onlookers watched with amazement. It wasn't the first time they'd seen this armor, but this would be the first run where every man of Bridge 4 had it. Altogether, it made an impressive sight. 10 days with 6 bridge runs had allowed Kaladin and his team to perfect their method. 5 men to be decoys, with 5 more in the front holding shields, and using only one arm to support the bridge. Their numbers were augmented by the wounded they'd saved from other crews, now strong enough to help carry. So far, despite 6 bridge runs, there hadn't been a single fatality. The other bridgemen were whispering about a miracle. Kaladin didn't know about that. He just made certain to keep a full pouch of infused spheres with him at all times. Most of the Parshendi archers seemed to focus on him. Somehow they could tell that he was the center of all this. They reached their bridge and formed up, shields strapped to rods on the sides to await use. As they hefted their bridge, a spontaneous round of cheering rose up from the other crews. "That's new," Teft said from Kaladin's left. "Guess they finally realized what we are," Kaladin said. "And what's that?" Kaladin settled the bridge onto his shoulders. "We're their champions." "Bridge forward!" They broke into a trot, leading the way down from the staging yard, ushered by cheers. My father is not insane, Adolin thought, alive with energy and excitement as his armorers strapped on his shard plate. Adolin had stewed over Navani's revelation for days. He'd been wrong in such a horrible way. Dalinar Kholin wasn't growing weak. He wasn't getting senile. He wasn't a coward. Dalinar had been right, and Adolin had been wrong. After much soul-searching, Adolin had come to a decision. He was glad that he'd been wrong. He grinned, flexing the fingers of his plated hand as the armorers moved to his other side. He didn't know what the visions meant or what the implications of those visions would be. His father was some kind of prophet, and that was daunting to consider. But for now, it was enough that Dalinar was not insane. It was time to trust him. Stormfather knew Dalinar had earned that right from his sons.
Ooh.
The armorers finished with Adolin's shard plate. As they stepped away, Adolin hurried out of the armoring room into the sunlight, adjusting to the combined strength, speed, and weight of the shard plate. Niter and 5 other members of the Cobalt Guard hastened up, one bringing Sureblood to him. Adolin took the reins, but led the Rashadium at first, wanting more time to adapt to his plate. They soon entered the staging area. Adolin's father, in his shard plate, was conferring with Teleb and Ilamar. He seemed to tower over them as he pointed eastward. Already, companies of soldiers were moving out onto the lip of the plains. Adolin strode up to his father, eager. In the distance, he noticed a figure riding down along the eastern rim of the war camps. The figure wore gleaming red shard plate. "Father?" Adolin said, pointing. "What's he doing here? Shouldn't he be waiting for us to ride to his camp?" Dalinar looked up. He waved for a groom to bring Gallant, and the two of them mounted. They rode down to intercept Sadeas, trailed by a dozen members of the Cobalt Guard. Did Sadeas want to call off the assault? Was he worried about failing against the tower again? Once they drew close, Dalinar pulled up. "You should be moving, Sadeas. Speed will be important if we're to get to the plateau before the Parshendi take the Gemheart and go." The High Prince nodded. "Agreed, in part. But we need to confer first. Dalinar, this is the tower we're assaulting." He seemed eager. "Yes, and?" "Damnation, man," Sadeas said. "You're the one who told me we needed to find a way to trap a large force of Parshendi on a plateau. The tower is perfect. They always bring a large force there, and 2 sides are inaccessible." Adolin found himself nodding. "Yes," he said. "Father, he's right. If we can box them in and hit them hard..." The Parshendi normally fled when they took large losses. That was one of the things extending the war so long. "It could mean a turning point in the war," Sadeas said, eyes alight. "My scribes estimate that they have no more than 20 or 30,000 troops left. The Parshendi will commit 10,000 here. They always do. But if we can corner and kill all of them, we could nearly destroy their ability to wage war on these plains." "It'll work, Father," Adolin said eagerly. "This could be what we've been waiting for. What you've been waiting for. A way to turn the war. A way to deal enough damage to the Parshendi that they can't afford to keep fighting." "We need troops, Dalinar," Sadeas said. "Lots of them. How many men could you field at a maximum?" "On short notice," Dalinar said. 8,000, perhaps? "It will have to do," Sadeas said. "I've managed to mobilize about 7,000. We'll bring them all. Get your 8,000 to my camp, and we'll take every one of my bridge crews and march together. The Parshendi will get there first. It's inevitable with a plateau that close to their side. But if we can be fast enough, we can corner them on the plateau. Then we'll show them what a real Alethi army is capable of." "I won't risk lives on your bridges, Sadeas," Dalinar said. "I don't know that I can agree to a completely joint assault."
So
"Bah," Sadeas said. "I've got a new way of using bridgemen. One that doesn't use nearly as many lives. Their casualties have dropped to almost nothing." "Really?" Dalinar said. "Is it because of those bridgemen with armor? What made you change?" Sadeas shrugged.
can't you guys hit each
"Perhaps
other?
you're getting through to me. Regardless, we need to go now. Together. With as many troops as they'll have, I can't risk engaging them and waiting for you to catch up. I want to go together and assault as closely together as we can manage. If you're still worried about the bridgemen, I can attack first and gain a foothold. Then let you cross without risking bridgemen lives." Dalinar looked thoughtful. "Come on, Father," Adolin thought. "You've been waiting for a chance to hit the Parshendi hard. This is it." "Very well," Dalinar said. "Adolin, send messengers to mobilize the 4th through 8th divisions. Prepare the men to march. Let's end this war."
All right.
65. The tower. "I see them. They are the rocks. They are the vengeful spirits.
What those words?
Eyes of red.
Kakakis, 1173. 8 seconds pre-death. A dark-eyed young woman of 15. Subject was reportedly mentally unstable since childhood. Several hours later, Dalinar stood with Sadeas on a rock formation overlooking the tower itself.
Okay.
It had been a hard, long march. This was a distant plateau, as far eastward as they had ever
Oh,
struck.
shit.
Plateaus beyond this point were impossible to take. The Parshendi could arrive so quickly that they had the gem heart out before the Alethi arrived. Sometimes that happened with the tower as well. Dalinar searched.
I see it,
He said, pointing.
they don't have the gem heart out yet.
A ring of Parshendi were pounding on the chrysalis. Its shell was like thick stone, however. It was still holding.
You should be glad you're using my bridges, old friend.
Sadeas shaded his face with a gauntleted hand.
Those chasms might be too wide for a shard bearer to jump.
Dalinar nodded. The tower was enormous. Even its huge size on the maps
Oh,
didn't do it
fuck.
justice.
I didn't look at the other.
Unlike other plateaus, it wasn't level. Instead, it was shaped like an enormous wedge that dipped toward the west, pointing a large cliff face in the stormward direction.
This might be
It was
high
too
for me.
steep, and the chasms too wide, to approach from the
keep
east or
going.
south. Only 3 adjacent plateaus could provide staging areas for assaults, all along the western or northwestern side. The chasms between these plateaus were unusually large, almost too wide for the bridges to span. On the nearby staging plateaus, thousands upon thousands of soldiers in blue or red were gathered, one color per plateau.
Swords, kitty.
Combined, they made for a
pussy.
larger force than Dalinar had ever seen brought against the Parshendi. The Parshendi numbers were as large as anticipated. There were at least
Should not have
10,000
jumped,
of
should not
them
have jumped.
lining up.
Maybe I don't jump this fast.
This would be a full-scale battle, the kind Dalinar had been hoping for. The kind that would let them pit a huge number of Alethi against a large Parshendi force. This could be it. The turning point in the war.
Okay.
Win this day and everything
We
would
shouldn't
change.
stab through each other.
Dalinar shaded his eyes as well, helm under his arm. He noted with satisfaction that Sadeas' scouting crews were crossing to adjacent plateaus, where they could watch for Parshendi reinforcements. Just because the Parshendi had brought so many at first, didn't mean that there were no other Parshendi forces waiting to flank them. Dalinar and Sadeas wouldn't be taken by surprise again.
Come with me, Sadeas said. Let us assault them together. A single grand wave of attack across 40 bridges.
Dalinar looked down at the bridge crews. Many of their members were lying exhausted on the plateau, awaiting, likely dreading, their next task. Very few of them wore the armor Sadeas had spoken of. Hundreds of them would be slaughtered in the assault if they attacked together. But was that any different from what Dalinar did? Asking his men to charge into battle to seize the plateau? Weren't they all part of the same army? The cracks. He wouldn't let them get wider. If he was going to be with Navani, he had to prove to himself he could remain firm in the other areas. No, he said. I will attack, but only after you've made a landing point for my bridge crews. Even that is more than I should allow. Never force your men to do as you yourself would not.
You do charge the Parshendi.
I'd never do it carrying one of those bridges, Dalinar said. I'm sorry, old friend. It's not a judgment of you. It's what I must do. Sadeas shook his head, pulling on his helmet.
Well, it will have to do. We still planning on dining together tonight to discuss strategy?
I assume so. Unless Elokar has a fit for both of us missing his feast. Sadeas snorted.
He's going to have to grow accustomed to it. 6 years of feasting every night is growing tedious. Besides, I doubt he'll feel anything but elation after we win this day, and leave the Parshendi down a full third of their soldiers. See you on the battlefield.
Dalinar nodded, and Sadeas jumped off the rock formation, dropping down to the surface
early.
below and joining his officers.
Oh, too
Dalinar
late.
lingered, looking
Tragic.
over at the tower. It was not only larger than most plateaus, it was rougher, covered with lumpish rock formations of hardened crem. The patterns were rolling and smooth, yet very uneven, like a field full of short walls covered by a blanket of snow. The southeastern tip of the plateau rose to a point overlooking the plains. The two plateaus they'd use were on the middle of the west side. Sadeas would take the northern one, and Dalinar would assault from one just below it. Once Sadeas